Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to another podcast with Amoda Maa. Hello, Amoda.
Hi, Kavi.
So it's been a while since we've done a podcast, but here we are. Today, we are going to talk about personality types and spiritual awakening. We're going to be exploring whether it's easier for certain personality types to awaken than other types. Are there certain traits and tendencies that are more oriented towards the dissolution of ego identity? Is the doorway to awakening the same for all individuals, even though personal characteristics vary widely? And does the personality have anything at all to do with the recognition and abiding in true nature? So we're going to touch on astrology, gene keys and human design. We're probably going to touch on the dosha system of Ayurveda and even kind of allude to the Enneagram, among others. You know, it has to be said at this stage, as we were talking about it beforehand, we're not going to be going into the specifics. So we're not going to break down each of the astrological signs and say, yes, this person, this type is ideal for awakening, and this person, this type is not. And the same with all of them. You know, some of these things Amoda particularly knows more about than others. I know very little about some of these things, for instance, the Enneagram. But so it's more to kind of unpack a bit the generalities, really, some of the more broad kind of aspects of the conversation. So let's jump into this. Amoda, where are we going to start with this? Where's a good place to begin?
There's I would say, delicate dance or edge between self and no self. In other words, the personhood, the personality, as the personhood expresses itself and how the individuation operates, and the no self, which we would say is true nature. I think there's a delicate dance between the two that is worth an exploration. I don't think there is a definitive answer, and I don't think, as far as I know, there are any there's any research on it or anything written about it or any knowledge about it. But I find it quite an interesting topic, which is why I suggested it, and certainly worthy of exploration. The question is there potentially a relationship between the personhood, the personality, the type of person one is, and the non-personality, the infinite true nature that we all ultimately are? You could say the personality is specific to the individual. It's unique to the individual with all its nuances. That's one sacred geometry, and that's what we can explore a little. And true nature is universal. Yeah, there's this kind of true nature and that kind of true nature. True nature is true nature. So what is the relationship? Only because the interesting thing is it's the person, the personhood, with all the levels and layers of its human uniqueness that is, if you like, on the path of seeking awakening. Now, is there a type of person, a type of a person with certain characteristics or certain traits, or certain psychological makeup that is more, if you like, attuned or closer or easier to awaken or not. I think it's worthy of a little bit of a conversation. And what do we mean by a personality? First of all, we have to understand or perhaps agree that each of us comes in with a unique imprint. Some of it is conditioned by our conditions, our parents, our family, our geography, and so on, our education, and that forms, and whatever lessons we've learned or whatever hardships we've come against or whatever traumas we've experienced. Some of our personality, if you like, is shaped by that or influenced by that. And some of it is prior to that conditioning. It's either very, very early at birth or prior to birth in the womb. And then prior to that, even the imprint that we come in with our, if you like, karmic tendencies. So we do each have a unique imprint. So it's not just on the surface, personality on the surface, but personality at the deepest, the sacred geometry we come into. And that's where you mentioned the doshas of Ayurveda, the Enneagram, astrological imprint, gene keys, and so on. These are not something that we become. It's something that we already are, at least on the level of the individuation. They're all clues or keys of reading or understanding our tendencies, the particular flavor and texture that we each are. Some people are more fiery, so on a very basic level. Some people are more earthy. Some people are more in the air realm. Of course, this is just one layer, and then there are many other layers. So I think it's relevant because, well, actually, inside of all that, and I know I'm kind of moving along here.
It's okay.
A little bit like a river, but we'll try and find a sort of doorway that opens up to something. But I think inside of everything that or at least I'm mentioning here, it's more about how the individual ego structure forms. Because whilst there's a universal, if you like, mechanism that forms the ego structure, for each individual, the ego with its various defense structures is going to be different. And that's where something like the Enneagram comes in, or even astrology comes in. Astrological imprint. Yeah, we're not talking about predictive astrology. Yeah, the defense structures are different for each individual. And there are certain conglomerates of defense structures that make up a particular type, if you like. And each of us, I think, needs to understand our own ego structure and the way that defendedness, the way those defense structures are operating in life. And that's valuable in the process or the journey of the undoing of those defense structures, or the willingness for those to be undone. Yeah, because very often there's this idea that awakening or freedom is just a bolt of lightning that comes, yeah, or we'll call it grace, whatever. And actually, it's more beneficial to understand what our own defense structures are, how the ego structure forms itself, and how it operates on a unique individual level to allow us to, or to facilitate the undoing of that in life, in the journey of life. And that facilitates the awakening that is so sought after. You know, we can give some examples, right?
Well, roll on. Let's give some examples.
Roll on
I have
with
some
some
things to
examples.
say, but I'm not going to interfere with your watery flow.
Examples. Well, I'll use myself as an example. I always do.
Very good. Very good.
I would say that one of my primary defense structures, in other words, the way that I would defend from anything that might hurt. And in my case, that was being seen for who I was. But yeah, being seen, exposing myself, being honest, being intimate, or being demanded of, if there was any need of me. My defense structure would be, I guess, retreat. Yeah, retreating, going into my shell. Now, retreat is, and going into one's shell is the need for space. Yeah, the need for my space, the need for being left alone. That's a defense structure. When we examine that, that's a very air quality. Yeah. So someone like myself who has 5 planets in my natal astrological chart, all in air signs, there's an indicator there. In the Enneagram, I'd be an Enneagram 5, which is very much the need for space, the need for solitude, which on one hand is a beautiful thing because it takes us into the deep self. But on the other hand, can be a defense structure. Yeah. So for somebody else, anger is a defense structure. Yeah. Anger, rage, attack, putting up a wall, my will against your will. That's a very strong defense structure.
And so I could say then, whether that comes through astrology or whatever, my defense structure would have been to in a watery kind of, with the Piscean moon, to get lost in, to a tendency towards addiction, because addiction was oblivion was escape was defense.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So
yes.
yeah.
Yes. So again, we can probably find the correlate for that in one of those systems. I think the Enneagram would describe that very well. So these are just small examples. It's not the be all and end all, but these kind of insights. So let me just say this. You see, then you take something like the 5 Enneagram and this particular defense strategy as I was just describing. The sort of the edge, that's why I said it's a delicate edge. On the one hand, that's a defense structure that is operating and can be seen in relationship to others, in relationship to the world, in childhood, and so on, and is a when it's kind of unconsciously operating, it if you like, keeps the ego structure intact.
Yes.
And then on the other hand, that's the sort of delicate dance. That particular ego structure is more, if you like, closer to the void of being. Yeah, because emptiness, solitude, aloneness is very close to the void of beingness. So it's the kind of structure that would either feel very isolated and very alone in a, let's say, negative sense, an isolation, alienation, and so on. But on the other hand, if it has the capacity to really soften into that, it's a doorway into the void of being. Yeah. And so that's where the
That's where that was where you went.
The actual experience of awakening is not, although it's the same awakening, the doorway is not always the same. That was my doorway. I fell into the void of being. I dissolved and died into emptiness. That's why when I speak about it, and it sounds so, I don't know, otherworldly or kind of something, and then, you know, the response is sometimes, oh, I want that, but I can't quite get there. It's not always appropriate for each individual. Yeah, it's not always the doorway.
Okay. 10,000 questions arise. Okay, so just on, let's just get to that point. The existential void. Now, you've talked about this a million times, and I know that your doorway was the doorway that you just referred to, which was the isolationism, the pulling back into being alone in a negative way, and that kind of compelled you or graced you to meet that void. Is the void that needs to be met the same, but the doorway is different?
I would say yes. The void is the void. That's what I mean.
So there are 10,000 doorways, but only one void, let's say. There's only one garden, but there are 10,000 doorways to that garden. And then what you're discussing, what you're positing here, in a sense, is actually, you know, we've already eradicated our argument about the personality types, in a sense, because what you're saying is that self-knowing is more important than the type. It's not the type that actually matters. It's not the dosha that ultimately matters. It's not the Enneagram that ultimately matters. They're the doorways, but they're not what ultimately matters. What matters is turning around and meeting our tendencies. And there, the tendency is the doorway.
Yes, I do think so. I think what's more important, actually, than the personality type, however we describe that personality type, is for some reason, there are some ego structures that are more fragile than others. And we come in with that imprint. Now, is that a personality type, or is it some karmic imprint? Yeah, which over lifetimes, that ego structure has become a little more permeable. When I say fragile, I mean permeable. Permeable because if we look at it in terms of lifetimes, which I'm not really one for the linearity of lifetimes, but let's say that this individuation, every individuation that emerges from the void, the beingness, the totality, is born of the one. So it's whether it's this particular one that's reincarnating, yeah, or whether it's just reincarnation is not affiliated to an individual self. It's, you know, many selves.
So we hold, to be you.
We hold the imprint. It's just that it's been many cycles. And we hold that imprint. It's not mine, but it has an imprint in me now. That repetition, I'm really positing this, and it just kind of following a thread of intuition here. That repetition, in a way, brings a certain, let's call it openness, to the ego structure, because it has become, if you like, on some level, that repetition, it has come to see, even if it's on a deep unconscious, subconscious level, that the impermanence of things and the clinging to experience, the being titillated or enamored or entranced by experience on a physical level, experience on a mental level, experience on an emotional level, experience on a cumulative level, experience on an entertainment level, experience on a knowledge level, experience on a, let's say, pleasure-seeking level. Yeah, that becomes a little bit tiresome. Yeah, we kind of subconsciously are almost ripe. We are ripe for something beyond. Yeah. And I think that creates a more permeable ego structure. Now, I'm really out there here with my
You are out there, honey.
flow, but I don't know. I'm kind of pulling on my own deep journey, if you like. Yeah. So this is a possibility, what's being suggested here. But I do think there are ego structures that are maybe weaker, more fragile, more open, more permeable. This is neither saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying how it is. If you like, on the negative side, a weaker
yes,
or
of course.
more fragile ego structure means that I don't have a strong sense of self. And in everyday life, that makes me a doormat, or makes me timid, or makes me insecure.
More prone to breakdown, more prone to suicide, more prone to mental illness, more prone to neurosis, more prone to all of those, what are considered the problem people in today's society and every society, really.
Yes. And so that can be the flip side, the negative side, if you like. But it can also, if we know ourselves, we go deep within and start to work with that, if you like, or move through that, it can also be a very profound doorway. Yeah. And again, I'm speaking from my own experience because I am one, or was one of those. Yeah. And so that can be a doorway where the ego structure comes undone more easily. It's closer to death, if you like. It's closer to psychological death. Yeah. And if you look at something like the gene keys system, which is quite a complex system, and we don't have all the knowledge of it, but we have some knowledge and understanding of it. Again, at least on an intuitive level, whoever's interested can look it up, but it is quite complex. But there are gateways in the psychophysiological mechanism associated with our genetic coding. And some of those gateways are closed and some of those gateways are open. And each incarnation, each incarnated individuation has a unique display, if you like, of those gateways. And you and I know, Kavi, and I think we both have this, we have very open gateways. Yeah.
Yes.
I think mine are all open. So openness is actually very, very natural. Yeah. Again, it has certain functional idiosyncrasies that means that, on a worldly level, certain characteristics are of I don't know, strength or empowerment or confidence or whatever they might be that society loves in order to be successful are not at the forefront. Yeah. But there's another quality. So again, we're using very personal examples, because we don't know all the types. But I just think that yeah. And and then you mentioned, I think, those who are perhaps on the edge of society, or we could say they're artists, the artists of this world, the mystics of this world, the outsiders in some way, or in the old culture, that would be the shamans. Perhaps that's what we're talking about. Maybe that's the
boy.
frequency holders. I don't know, but I think it's worth and let's just look at I know we're jumping around, but let's just mention for a moment or two babies who are very open. Their ego structure hasn't formed yet. Yes, there's an imprint. Yeah, some babies come in angry and some babies come in more cheerful and joyful. But really, a quality of babies beyond their particular little imprint is openness. Their ego structure has not formed yet. The ego structure forms, I think, around the ages of 5 to 7. Yeah. That's when we become who we are on a personality level. Yeah. That openness of the psychological structure is what gives babies the qualities that are the same qualities, the qualities of awakening: joy, flow, the ability for emotions to flow without sticking. Yeah, everything is experienced. Innocence, acute, sensorial, experience that can be delight.
Yeah, kind of ecstasy, really.
Yeah, all of that. So unconditional love. Yeah. Aliveness, vibrancy. There's a natural state of awakeness in that isn't self-recognized. It can only be recognized when we've developed the mental, psychological faculties for that. Yeah? But it's a natural state of awakeness. I think if we perhaps look at some, call them primitive cultures, but I don't mean that really in that sense. Let's say
original cultures.
Original cultures.
As far as we know.
As far as we know, Aboriginal cultures. I think the Aborigines are probably the best example of that. And again, I don't know much about it because I haven't interacted with Aboriginal cultures, but as far as I can get a sense of, that's a very natural state of awakeness. Yeah. It's very attuned to the totality, to beingness, to the oneness, to again, there's an innocence in it, and so on and so on. These are all examples of a less formed ego identity. And as the individual progresses, develops through life, and as society or civilization develops, that ego identity becomes stronger. We become to be identified by our culture, by our opinions, by our beliefs, by our education, and so on. So ego identity gets stronger. So I think this idea, if you like, of the density of ego structure, or the more permeability of ego structure is kind of perhaps fundamental. How we measure that, I don't know. I don't think it's about measuring it. I think it's about knowing it in ourselves.
What do you mean? What's this measuring exactly?
Well, we can't exactly measure the density of somebody's ego structure and say, well, you've got a little more work to do.
You got a little more ego.
You've got more ego.
There.
So you're going to have to take longer on your spiritual journey.
Oh man, you've really stirred my hornet's nest of the mind here in many ways. I don't come with a fixed idea, but when you talk about for instance, the Aboriginal culture, or some of the earlier peoples, you see less concern or interest or anything in what astrological type or enneagram or gene keys any of those people are. And what I hear you saying is that that's for a whole different number of reasons, but also because it's not such an ego-driven culture. So that suggests in some way, if you reverse it, that ego, the formation in these modern societies of the ego structure is then either exaggerating, exacerbating, or multiplying, or what is the relationship of these things that we take? We love our systems. Modern human beings love systems, right? We've got the gene key system, we've got the dosha system, and we've got the enneagram, we've got a million different systems, and they all do speak to things, very specifically. I know when the doctors have identified me as a vata and described what a vata is in the Ayurvedic system, I'm like, that's me. You've described me absolutely accurately, but is that, do you know what I'm trying to get at? It's like,
well, there's the ego structure, which is, if you like, a symptom or a product of development, yeah, in our society, or collectively. And that's primarily made up of defensive structures. And those defensive structures, psychological strategies, we should call them.
yes, that's good.
Operate to seemingly protect us from anything that we feel will hurt us. And I'm not talking about somebody punching us in the face or something, like that. Psychological pain. And that could be as simple as simply not liking what I'm experiencing. The inability to be with what is, whether it's an emotion, a feeling, an experience, the experience of life, the inability to be with it, to fully just be with what is, creates a defensive structure to protect us psychologically from what is. Yeah. So a baby and a, let's say, Aboriginal culture doesn't have that, hasn't developed that yet. The ability to be with what is, which is what the whole spiritual path is. Then the something like the understanding of the Ayurvedic doshas, which has a physiological component to it, as well as a psychological component to it, is less about the ego structure, but more about our actual manifest energy, how life force moves in us. It has got to correlate with what we might call personality, but it's much more physiological. It's how we digest, it's how we perceive, it's how we assimilate. But of course, digestion, perception, and assimilation all happen not just physically, they happen mentally and emotionally. So it's the whole system. And I think as well, you know this as well as I do, if not more so, the Ayurvedic, is it the rishis? The ancient rishis, they had deep knowledge of this. And this deep knowledge and deep wisdom served them, not because they were looking at ego structure, but it served them to find balance and harmony on all levels of being.
Mm.
So that is valuable. That
Yes.
is valuable to know that. And I don't know if Aboriginal cultures have that. I mean, maybe they do. Maybe it's to do with the, I don't know, whatever song sings them into birth, whatever,
Mm.
yeah, or whatever. I don't know.
It's probably also the case that the closer you are to harmony, inner harmony and outer harmony, the less concerned you are about what's pulled you away because you're not out of harmony. It's the point of our obsession with everything is that we're out of alignment and harmony within ourselves and outside ourselves because there's only one thing happening, and that causes us, doesn't it? It's that is the fundamental sort of self-referencing problem. Maybe there isn't a problem at all anyway, but if we feel as if there's a problem because we feel disconnected, we feel separate, we feel, and that can apply to any of the star signs, let's say. You don't have to be an earth sign or an air sign or a water sign to feel disconnected. You might feel it in your nuanced way, which is the point about knowing yourself. Know what it is that how it is that you feel kind of, if you like, disconnected. It's an easy thing to say, but that is alienated is the correct term. And there's the doorway again.
Mm, mm, mm,
Whereas talking glibly about the Aboriginal culture, using that as an example of a kind of primal state that is connected
mm.
within itself. It's harmonious with the outside, with nature, with the cosmos, with what the stars. Doesn't need to know necessarily what the stars are doing, although that might be useful as well. But actually, it's in relationship all the time to those, whereas that seems to be part of our intrinsic problem.
Yes, yes, precisely. Again, it's pointing to the many defense structures, strategies that it's not just the modern human being, but
Mm.
as humanity has developed over time, um, the many defense strategies that they're like layers of perception. I mean, veils of perception, veil upon veil upon veil of perception that then disconnects us from the totality, from the totality of the beingness, that the one beingness that informs us all. And so we become more and more reduced into our individual identity. So then we almost have to go through that individual identity to start to
Mm.
to move through it, and hence, yeah, hence the obsession with what kind of person I am and what kind of type I am, and if I understood myself more. And some of that is counterproductive and some of it is valuable.
It's the same thing that we've pointed to in different podcasts, is that if you get stuck in the realm of self, then those systems, that astrology or that enneagram or any of those kind of systems can actually, from feeling like they're liberating, can actually become the next prison, from one prison to
Yes,
another prison. And that's the point, is not to get stuck in any of those systems. They're
absolutely.
only they're only, what are they, boats? They're only ships to get you to the shore of unity, aren't they?
Yes, because the danger of that is, well, I know my type now. I know
Yeah.
how, yeah, that's who I am. I can't help it. I was born that way, or I was created that way. And that's exactly what you're speaking of. That's not what
Mm.
we're talking about. The understanding, it's yeah, to understand the doorway. What is it that I'm holding up, and what is a veil of, what is a veil in me? What veil am I looking through? Because this is about undoing the veils.
That's also a kind of, there's a karmic thing in there that you were sort of referring to earlier. That is part of the karma, and part of the work, if there is any work of each human being, each individuation, is to realize the nature of their own karmic patterns, which is the strategies and structures that you're talking about, not the specifics of one's karma, but actually the fact that one's involved in a karmic dance endlessly through the individual patterning that we're talking about. And there again, there's the doorway.
Yes.
You wake up to your own kind of karma and something ends. But
Yes.
still, that's because I was going to ask this. I mean, just as we're moving through this, I would be really very interested to find out of a survey of all the awakened teachers, let's say, around at the moment, to see what star sign they are, what astrological sign they are, what Enneagram, for instance, they are, what gene keys type they are. I actually think that that would be, a very interesting study to do. And if anybody out there wants to take that study on, I challenge you, would you go and find out, yeah, and come
Well,
back and we'll do a podcast with you.
that's a fabulous PhD project. I mean, if I if I was still in my PhD days, which is a very, very, very long time ago now, I would actually make that into an interesting project.
Wouldn't
I
it?
mean, I know that somebody like Steve Taylor, who's written a couple of books and
Hmm.
people may have heard of, he's done some research. I don't think it's quite that, but he has done research on types of awakening, conditions for awakening, uh, levels, if you like, or intensity of awakening. What's been the catalyst, what's been the not the kind of person, but the situation. Are there certain situations? I think he's done some extensive research into that. I don't think it quite goes to the place of, examining Enneagram and genetic
Mm,
coding and
mm.
that. I mean, that's on a whole other level, but it would be fascinating. Yeah. Um, yeah, who knows?
Because, sorry, you were going to say
I
something.
think all I wanted to say just on that is again to just reaffirm that what we're really speaking about is bringing light to the shadow, bringing
Ah, yes.
light to those areas in ourselves that we can call shadow realms, but that which we can't see, the veils of perception, the layers of defense strategies, everything that prevents us from knowing the one beingness that informs us all, that is beyond this individuation. So it really is about bringing light to that. So anything that assists in it is helpful, but it's not a reason or an excuse to re-identify with that self and say, oh yeah, this is me, this is how I am, and I can't help it.
Well, yes. No, I mean, let me just, I can bear testimony to that as well, because, when I've discovered, as you've helped me, because you know quite a lot about astrology, and allowed me to see the nature of my Piscean moon, which means, many different things, tendency to merge with things, tendency to get addicted to things, etc., etc. And the Virgo rising, all these things. So as an Aquarian, to understand some of the aspects of myself, and then as an Ayurvedic type, to be a Vata, very prone to flightiness, very prone to anxiety, very prone to fear and mind running off into the things, and all of those things have been absolutely exquisitely valuable to me, and on the other hand, haven't made a blind bit of difference to any awakening that has happened here, because I've still had to meet the very fact of life, the very fact of my experience, the very fact of that I want to kind of strategize a way to survive psychologically in this world. And I've had to meet that regardless of any type that I am. And there's the rub.
Yes. I go back to the beginning of our conversation, which is this delicate dance between the two. I would say that, and again, I can't be absolutely certain, but I'm positing that the many different forms of expression that we find in various awakened individuals, awakened teachers, spiritual teachers, of which there is an increasing plethora. Yeah, the many different flavors of that isn't because there's a different type of awakening, but
Yes.
because of this unique
Yeah.
way that it has taken place and the unique structure that has been the very doorway for that awakening. And therefore, it gets expressed slightly differently for each individual. That's why, and I'm speaking now to those seekers who may see this teacher and that teacher, or jump around from this one or this YouTube or that one and say, oh, well, that one's got it, that one hasn't got it. This one says it like this one says it like that. And they're either confused by it, or they're comparing it, or so on and so on. I'm saying this is why, because it's uniquely coming through, not only coming through the expression of this particular vehicle, but also in the way that it took place, the doorway that it took place. But it's always pointing, if it's a genuine awakening, to the same. Yeah. So we have to have a very broad view. And once we have an understanding of the myriad of incarnations and individuations and everything that we're speaking about here, then we're less likely to compare, criticize, elevate, denigrate, but actually listen to that which is beyond the expression, if you like. Because it really is going to be different for each. It's like each flower. Each flower is unique, and yet and each fragrance is unique, and yet there's something universal. Flowerness. The fragrance of flowerness is universal. The nectar is the same.
Oh, they all come from the same garden.
But they're all different. Unique.
Well, this is very good, because right at the beginning of this podcast, I was going to reverse engineer what we were talking about and say that yes, the doorway through one's self, through one's whatever doorway that we discussed, is going to be a different doorway to the same garden, let's say, as a metaphor. But then like you're just saying, this was reverse engineering, but then the expression of that garden is still going to come through the individual, with all of its characteristics.
Yes.
I mean, I've seen so many different teachers, and it is easy to get into a kind of comparison thing, whatever, it's sort of almost part of the nature. Go.
It's also easy to say, this is the way you do it.
Yes.
If you follow this practice, if you follow this scripture, if you follow this teaching, if you follow this tradition, if you follow this method, you're going to get there. And that's not true. Yeah, because that's alluding to what we're speaking of now. The doorway is always unique. You have to know thyself is more important than which practice you follow or which tradition you follow.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah,
there isn't one size fits all.
No, because what might work for one, and then another applies that and thinks, well, it's worked for them, then it must work for me. And they spend their life banging their head against a wall, thinking that that's the way to liberation. And all they've ended up with is a very sore head. It hasn't kind of worked, because their way was utterly different.
Yes. And then there is the direct way, which is the pointing to the primary mechanism of ego, which is resistance to what is. Yeah, that cuts through all this. Yeah, resistance to what is the primary mechanism. That resistance and the way the mechanism operates and the conditions in which it operates, and the situations and relationships within which it operates, is going to be unique for each individual.
Yeah.
But we must see that within ourselves. And then that's not a method, that's a clear seeing. It's a clear seeing of the core structure of ego.
Get to the root.
It's
Yeah,
the
you
root.
talk about the root.
It's the root. But we often can't get to the root until we've actually seen and worked through the various layers. Again, it all comes down to surrender. Not surrender to anything, but the surrender of the defense structures.
Yes, but this is very true, because what the reason that we brought this podcast to the table is not for some titillation. It's also because whereas you just demolished most of the podcast by saying just get to the root. But actually, it's not a titillation to discuss these things, because actually, self-knowledge on this level that we're talking about, is almost it is primary. It is in there, because the deeper that you can go into self-knowing, the more likely something is to open. It just does. It just starts to open doorways, and those doorways at some point are going to open you to the fact that you have to face something very core about yourself. It won't happen unless it comes as a bolt of lightning, which I wouldn't wait for that. I don't think that's worth waiting for, because it's not somewhere else. It's in you. But this self-knowing, that's why that's such a fundamentally profound statement. Know thyself means know who you are, know your characteristics, know your defense mechanism, know your strategies, know your weaknesses, know your strengths, and all of that kind of stuff. Don't identify with it. It's what you've done in the past, but
well, the
be
more
open,
you see the structures that make up this defended, I don't know, whatever self, whether it's a fearful self or an angry self or a striving self or a lonely self, they're all defended structures. The more you see that, the more you really, not just see it, but feel it, the more you come to see the prison, the more you come to experience it as a prison.
Yes.
And then there's a willingness to be free of that, not by fixing it or changing your personality, but that's what brings you closer to the root of it, which is universal root. Yeah. Resistance to what is. Yeah. The craving and aversion that wraps itself around this moment, this moment, this moment. But that's what brings you close to it. That's what brings you to the core. Without that, there's no prison to see. The prison's just operating unconsciously.
Yes.
Maybe there's some vague sense that there's something more, or some more happiness, or some more peace, or something, or some idea of enlightenment, which is just a striving of the self for another persona, another mask, another identity. Yeah, so we have to go in and in and in. And this is what I mean by, and I think you've heard me say this, you have to be sick and tired of yourself.
Yes.
Before something can shift. And that sick and tired of yourself isn't just some glib kind of, oh God, I wish I was different. And, I'm not happy with my personality. No, never mind your personality. Just sick and tired of the various veils and strategies that play themselves out over and over again to protect you from what? To protect you from the rawness of this moment. That's all it is. The aliveness of this moment that is inherent in this moment, because it is absolutely as it is. That's when you're sick and tired of it. You're sick and tired of the defendedness, the strategies, the layers. Then something can shift. Yeah? Then something can open. That's the openness or the permeability of the ego structure that we started with. Whether you're born with a more permeable ego structure, whether you've become more permeable in your ego structure because actually you're more broken. Yeah, brokenness can go two ways. You can identify with that brokenness and then you become a trauma identified person, a poor me and a victim, and that can stay like that. Or brokenness can be the doorway to permeability.
It can, yes, very much so.
As they say, the what was it? The wounds are where or the cracks are where the light gets in, or the wound.
Yeah. Yeah, so Rumi and Leonard Cohen, the wound is where the light gets in. The
Yeah.
cracks, yeah, the beauty is in the cracks.
Yes.
I think you said it very, very well there, I think. And maybe we should take that to kind of as a conclusion. Yeah.
I think
One
that's
thing I feel the call to do is to say that if anybody listening has never checked out their gene keys and human design, I don't know, there's just something absolutely exquisite about it. You get so much self-knowledge in it. You get to know what your lower states of being if are, if you like. It's just a great doorway. And Richard Rudd, who who downloaded and kind of pretty much created, I think, put together the gene keys based on the human design system, is a genius and well worthy of anybody's attention. We met him once and he gave us a reading, and it was profound. I have to say, it
it
was
was.
profound and has lived with us and lit something within us, particularly in Amoda, that has lasted. And that was over 20 years ago, and it's still stayed. And it's a perennial truth. We don't use it as a system, but it doesn't need to be, because it's just a living truth somehow. And that is, so I just want to say, and if there's one person I would love to talk to on this podcast, and Richard Rudd ever heard this, I would so love to hear his genius wisdom, because it's just a fantastic system.
Yes,
Anything else to say,
indeed.
Amoda, at this stage?
No, I think that's enough.
Yeah, I think it is enough. I actually, on some certain level, think we've only just kind of scratched the surface of this. But we'll see what happens, whether we come back to it or not. We'll probably move on in our inevitable Aquarian way. We'll move on to something else, some other juicy subject. I think I hope people got some value out of this.
Certainly
And
food for thought.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't take it as a truth or anything. It's just the possibility of an exploration deeper inside, because the fundamental thing is to know oneself and not to get too attached to that knowing. Okay, thank you
That's
so
right.
much. Thank you, Amoda. That was a beautiful, juicy conversation. I always love speaking to you, as you know. Um, Take care, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe, like the podcast, share it wherever you can, and we'll see you again as soon as possible for another podcast with Amoda Maa. Take care. Goodbye. Namaste.
Namaste.